Greetings, this is Father Harvey Henderson at St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Grand Forks, North Dakota. We're continuing with our careful reading of the Gospel of Matthew this week, chapter 20. Chapter 20 marks a bit of a turning point in the Gospel next Sunday, beginning with chapter 21. The focus is very much on that last week of Jesus' life. Next chapter 21 is the account of his entry into the city of Jerusalem on what we often celebrate in the church as Palm Sunday. So today we begin with a parable which is unique to Matthew's gospel. That is, it's not in any of the other gospels, especially Mark or Luke. As a bit of a refresher, Matthew almost certainly had Mark's gospel in front of him as he prepared to write his own gospel. He adds a birth story to the beginning of that and several bits and parables, especially of his own teaching there, but oftentimes he copies directly from the Gospel of Mark and from another source which he shares with Luke of a collection of sayings that were circulating about Jesus around the middle to the end of that first century. So chapter 20, verses 1 through 16, the workers in the vineyard. Anybody who's in business knows that this would be a very bad plan to agree to pay workers for the full day and then to pay the ones who worked only for an hour the same wage. In the country where I grew up in Canada, the unions would never allow you to get away with such a practice. But even in the not too distant past, I'm told, when I lived down in Wyndmere and farming country, that a few generations ago the farmer could go into the local restaurant or bar at a particular time in the season and hire workers then, all of whom in those days would have been skilled at driving combines and trucks and grain carts and other kinds of things. So this practice of going to the marketplace for workers is not totally foreign, but Matthew is making a point here. He's not commenting really on the social practices of his own generation, but rather is saying that the kingdom of heaven, this is Matthew's peculiar phrase in deference to the name of God. He doesn't use the phrase the kingdom of God. The kingdom of heaven is like this parable. In other words, the kingdom of heaven is not about how much work we do to earn our way into the kingdom, but rather it is given to us by God's grace. And some say that this parable may have been aimed at the disciples themselves in the verses following the parable. For example, James and John, at least the mother of James and John, perhaps at their behest or perhaps on her own initiative, asks a favor of Jesus if those two sons of hers could sit one at his right hand and one at his left when he comes in his glory. So perhaps Matthew appends the parable to the beginning of this account to show that just because the disciples have been with Jesus from the beginning of his ministry does not necessarily earn them a special place in the kingdom of heaven. And Professor Wright points out in his little commentary that why is it that those workers were still in the marketplace at the end of the day? Most likely, he says, because no one wanted to hire them. Maybe they had a bad reputation, or they were known to be lazy workers, or those kinds of things. Jesus, again, emphasizing the point that entry into the kingdom of heaven is not by the works that we do. Recall some of the folks that Jesus associates with throughout the gospel story. He's accused at one point of being a glutton and a drunkard because he shares meals with not only the rich and powerful, the Pharisees and other religious groups, but with the tax collectors and sinners, they're called, with prostitutes and others of his day. He reaches out to all of those people. And so the end of this particular parable has one of those familiar phrases that the first will be last and the last first. We've just heard this not long ago. And if you think of, again, where the first are last and the last are first is in a circle rather than in a straight line. The world in which we live is very much ordered in straight line fashion, and one usually starts at the bottom of the ladder and works one's way to the top of the ladder. Even in clergy circles, this is seen to be a particular practice at hand. But Jesus is reminding his disciples and us to this day that the goal is not to be like those in the rest of the world, but rather to be that kind of servant leadership in the world, as Jesus himself modeled for us. He was the perfect servant. So the kingdom of heaven is not the kind of thing that we can bargain for or that we can store up points in heaven, but that those who come to faith later in life even are receive the same grace as those of us who have been in the pew for as long as we can remember from the time of our baptism as infants and young children. So in reality, Jesus is not commenting on the marketplace of his particular time. A little bit more about this story of the mother of the two sons of Zebedee, James and John. Recall, these were the first of those four disciples to be called, James and John, and the other two brothers, Peter and Andrew, who are called, and she's asking a special favor for them. Jesus is patient in his response, at least in the part that is recorded for us in Matthew's Gospel, that the right hand and the left hand is not mine to give, but belongs to God the Father. And then this curious reference to drinking the cup. Jesus is almost certainly referring to the cup that he will share at the Passover meal with his disciples. This goes on in Christian lore and tradition to be known as the Holy Grail. But he's also using the metaphor of the cup that he will drink as a reference to his own death, I think, and saying to those disciples, you certainly will drink this same cup. In other words, after I'm gone and risen from the dead, and you folks are about doing God's work, you too will likely suffer and be killed because of this. And tradition has it that 11 of the 12 disciples die a criminal's death because of their preaching of the gospel. Only John lives to be of old age and is exiled to the Isle of Patmos, from which he writes that curious book called the Book of Revelation that ends our particular New Testament. So once again, Jesus, the place is not mine to give, he says. It belongs to God. A short healing story here towards the end of the gospel in verses 29 through 34. The case of Jesus is in Jericho, a city not far from the city of Jerusalem, and the two blind men call out to him, "Have pity on us, Master, Son of David." The Son of David title is not accidental. Again, if you look at the genealogy in Matthew's Gospel near the beginning, you will see that Matthew traces the ancestry of Jesus back from his father Joseph to King David about 1,000 years before the time of Jesus, and then even on to the time of Abraham and Sarah about 1,800 years before the time of Jesus. So in 587 BC, when the people of when God's chosen people are exiled from the city of Jerusalem by the Babylonians, the city and the temple are destroyed, there builds within them this longing for a rescuer, a Messiah, to deliver them. A Messiah meaning literally an anointed one. We can recall in the books of 1 Samuel where the prophet Samuel pours oil and on the head of and anoints David as the chosen king. Well, the tradition, the longing rose up that folks were looking for a new King David, a military leader who would overthrow the Romans. Jesus is, as Matthew and Luke point out, a descendant of David, but his kind of rule and his kingship are very different than what his disciples have in mind. Hence, at the beginning of this chapter, Jesus predicts again for the third time that he must suffer and die and be raised from the dead. This is a third reminder because this would have been a very difficult thing for the disciples to hear and to understand. In fact, it wasn't until after the resurrection that they had some idea of what Jesus meant by this. See it through what some of us like to call resurrection lenses. We have the benefit of that. We know the end of the story. The disciples in the gospel stories do not know how things will come out in the end. So one can sympathize with their confusion, their misunderstanding of what Jesus is trying to teach them. Another important word here that's used of Jesus, it's said that Jesus had compassion upon these two blind men. First of all, before his compassion, he asks what seems like an obvious question: what is it you want me to do for you? Well, it's clear, likely by this point to Jesus, that the men are blind. The crowds try to shove them away, but Jesus invites them in and has a conversation with them. They ascribe to him this title, Master or Lord and Son of David. And then he says, what do you want me to do? Well, the obvious thing would be to open their eyes. And so Jesus has compassion. This is an important word that's not used often in the gospel stories, but it's much more than sympathy. It's much more than empathy even. This idea of compassion in the Greek language means literally to be moved in one's guts. Jesus is moved deeply by these two blind men, as he is by the human need that's all around him, the poor and the sick, the hungry and the homeless, the widows and the orphans of his generation. So he's moved here once again with compassion. And what happens when he touches their eyes? This is the kind of miracle story where touch is used. Sometimes Jesus heals by just a word, and sometimes even then just at a distance. But here he actually touches their eyes, and once again they can see, but then they respond and they follow him. They too become his disciples. So the Son of David, Jesus, was one of great compassion. Open our eyes, Master. So that concludes what I have to say about chapter 20. Thanks for tuning in all these weeks. Next week, as I said earlier, we read of the Jesus' entry into Jerusalem. Just another reminder that the gospel stories were really written backwards. These closing chapters, beginning with the entrance into Jerusalem, and then the subsequent, the Last Supper, the arrest, the trial, the death, crucifixion, and resurrection of Jesus, are all the most well-remembered parts of the story. And we'll see as we read them that they go into great detail. And then the gospel writers added their collections of stories onto the front ends of these. So we, as I said, come to this turning point in the Gospel of Matthew. We continue for another several weeks. The first Sunday of Advent is the last Sunday in November, and we'll finish up our study by then. Thanks. Be well. God bless.